And we've got Viola, sorry, from the Helicopter Association, Curt Castagna. Oh man, I'm off to a bad start. Castagna from NATA, National Air Transportation Association, Pete Bunce, General Aviation Manufacturers Association, Ed Bolen from the National Business Aviation Association, and of course, Jack Pelton from EAA. So thanks guys for being here. And so we are gonna talk through what's happening with unleaded fuel and that whole situation right now. Then we're gonna take some questions at the end. And we can, I think we'll have time to open the questions up to a little bit broader than just the fuel issue, since we've got this great brain trust here from DC to talk about issues beyond that are facing general aviation. So, as I said, lead in avgas has been a problem for a very long time. We've got to do something about it. We can argue all day long in our little community here about really how much lead is there and how dangerous are the emissions that we're putting out and how much lead is that really a problem? It doesn't matter, because it's a toxin. People don't want it in their neighborhood, and in the end, it's really going to be good for general aviation to get lead out and come up with a solution. It's better for our engines, and it's going to help us be better citizens, as it were, and help our airport communities. So there have been several attempts, as I said. The PAFI, the Fuels Initiative that was started a decade or so ago to bring the industry together to try to come up with a fuel that worked, has been out there. So far, hasn't produced a fuel, but it's still working. Meanwhile, a couple of other companies, Swift and GAMI, have been out and tried to develop fuels on their own using an STC process, and we've had some good success there, but there's still some challenges facing that. So the FAA, and working with industry a little over a year ago, came up with this idea of EAGLE, which is an organization they wanted to put together to eliminate aviation gasoline lead emissions, EAGLE. And so the idea is that not only to help facilitate the creation of this fuel, but to get it introduced into the community, into the industry. And there's a lot of challenges there, many of them that I think many of us didn't recognize need to be accomplished. And so that's what EAGLE's real goal is, to help facilitate the introduction of this fuel from getting it, from the refineries, getting it refined, getting it from the refineries to the airports, and helping FBOs and flight schools and everybody else impacted by this to get through that process. So, EAGLE's been out there, like I said, for a little over a year now. Mark Baker is the co-chair of that, along with a representative from the FAA who's not here today. So Mark, let's start with you. Tell us kind of what's the state of EAGLE and where are we and what are we all working on?
Well, it's over. Right, Pete? Oh, we wish. This is the biggest challenge I've seen in my 40-plus years of flying, just in the aircraft, and it's one that we all want to solve. But I think it's important to kind of level set everybody and to kind of see the market, understand what we're doing. We're down 99%. The amount of lead we put here in the 60s when the airlines, the military, and all the general aviation burned low lead gas. At that time, it was actually 90 low lead, 130 octane. We moved down to 100 octane in the 70s. So we're down a lot, but it's not good enough. There's two big problems that I want to point out. One is, even if we wanted to keep tetraethylene lead, there's only one plant in the world that makes any commercial quantity of it, Liverpool, England. How much longer that's going to be there, we don't know. It's there for now, and it is giving us a supply of TL. But so we have a supply chain challenge. More importantly, we have an image problem, in my mind. In general aviation, we don't want to be a polluter of the neighborhoods and skies that we fly over. And we know we're the last bastion of airborne lead particles is in what happens in the aircraft now. We burn about 180 million gallons of avgas in this country, which is about equivalent to 3-4 hours of car gas. So, in the greater scheme of things, yes, it's pretty small and it's pretty well distributed, and it's been tested at a lot of airports around the country. It has not really found the residue that some people would like it to find. But I can tell you, I'd rather be on the other side of the argument about why this airport should go away than our side of the argument about trying to protect lead for a while longer. And that's why, as an industry, we agreed as no later than 2030, we'd like to be transitioned away from low lead to a no lead formula that works in all aircraft as a drop-in replacement. Again, you've heard me say this before, but it would have been easy, but done a long, long time ago. People in this country have spent millions and millions of dollars, including you as taxpayers, $50 million for PAFI, and lots of these really smart companies, Phillips or BP Lyndale, Shell, all these companies have spent millions of dollars trying to figure this out. It's not simple. That said, Eagle was formed with this group a few months ago. The idea we've got to push energy to this thing. We've got to find a way to communicate to the whole constituency, which is the refiners, the blenders, the distributors, the users, and then ultimately to the states and their EPA. The EPA is probably going to come up with their engagement finding sometime later this fall, which is going to say no amount of airborne lead is acceptable. And we know that's probably in the words exactly how they're going to produce it. I'm not sure, but it will start to enable your local airports to say, what do we do with this airport in our backyard? And that's going to be very important. We have a solution that is got a timeline to it that gets done. That's why this group was formed. Larry O'Lou is my co-chair at FAA, and she's terrific. She actually really pushes the energy in this right direction. She's been around the FAA for a great long time. You know, I just got off the phone this morning with a couple hour meeting with Phillips Petroleum. They're working hard on alternative formulas through the PAFI process. We only have one fuel approved today with the STC process, that's the gammy fuel. Yet it's not commercially available, being run in a few places, Cirrus, hopefully some other places like Robinson, hopefully soon. So we've got some fuel being moved out there just so people can build some acceptance of that fuel. We don't believe Swift is too far behind with their R100. But this group is put together specifically to help move the ball, communicate, protect our availability of low-lead fuel until we have that transition.
Okay, so can you give us a little more about what's happening with the fuels that are in development at both the PAFI and on the STC side?
So first, I just want to say this is one of those occurrences where you've got all the major GA associations together, and really hats off to Charlie and the Redbird team for bringing us all together, because one, we care about this issue a lot, but we care about what you all do, because everything you do determines the future of this industry. And Jack said it, everybody said it. Thank you for what you're doing, and how cool it is for us to be able to look out in the audience to see the number of ladies that are out there now. You know, because a few years ago, there weren't any. And, you know, it was just our demographics are changing for the better. And I think it just jazzes all of us to be able to see the number of ladies, because we're starting to tap into half of the society that should be as passionate about aviation as males have been for so many years. So anyway, with that, when we look at the PAFI initiative, which has been going for several years, the beauty of the PAFI program was that there was transparency throughout that process, the transparency of being able to have all the manufacturers participate and support in-kind testing of the fuels. And the ultimate goal out of the PAFI program was an ASTM standard. We all know standards bodies out there, SAE, ASTM, all these others. But ASTM has always been the umbrella organization to be able to provide a standard fuel or a spec that standardizes so everybody has confidence in the whole very complex distribution chain. So that comes with the development of PAFI, but we also know what the chemical composition is of these fuels, and that's very important, because the worst thing for all of us, the nightmare scenario that we can envision, is all of a sudden we get a fuel and a few years down the road the EPA says, no, that chemical that you have out there is bad to either emit in the atmosphere, or if you have underground storage tanks, that emits into the groundwater supply. And that's something we're learning out of the PAFI program with some of the chemicals that we will have to deal with at probably a state-by-state basis. And we've learned this through the PAFI program. So now with the STC fuels, and of course we all support any companies that want to go through that process. But with the STC process, you don't have the transparency that you have through the other process. We, as manufacturers, we do not know what the min spec is for the fuel right now. So although we have Cirrus that's gone through the testing of the gammy fuel, and everything that we've seen, we get reports out, hey, we might have the secret sauce there, and we're very encouraged by it. But what gammy used was a different type of detonation criteria. So the margins that we used in the normal certification of piston engines gave us a detonation margin that we developed many, many years ago. We used oscilloscopes and things like that to be able to give that margin of safety there, so that you don't have heat propagation that destroys the cylinders. But without knowing what the min spec is, there's no way for us really to be able to tell whether we can meet certification standards. And George Braley, very smart guy in Ada, Oklahoma, in his SCC process used a different detonation methodology that allows us, as we understand it, he was able to shrink those margins because he could measure more accurately. We want the FAA to be able to make that methodology available to Lycoming and to Continental, and then the airframe OEMs to be able to go and evaluate these fuels to be able to say, okay, yes, it meets the right safety margins, because ultimately the job as manufacturers is not to put anybody in danger while they're flying. We can't afford that. And then Curt will obviously talk about standards that are needed within the supply chain to give everybody confidence. And think about the rail spills that we've had recently in this country. All of a sudden, we have a truck or a tanker load of this stuff derail, dump on the ground and everything. Are they going to be liable if something bad gets into the groundwater and as looked at? So it's very important for this ecosystem that we have, and this talks to the complexity of it, that we have the transparency to know what the min spec is, which would tell us what the chemical composition is, but it also allows us to validate at the right level all of the reliability and assurances that the manufacturers need to be able to say, yea, verily, you can use this in your aircraft.
So one of the issues that's happening right now is because some communities are so anxious to get rid of 100 low lead that they are simply not allowing it to be sold at their airports. And they're encouraging everybody to use unleaded fuel, which Swift has an unleaded fuel available at 93 octane. I think it's 93 and 94 octane. And that works for low compression engines, which many of the training airplanes are. The really bad side of that is that we are now sort of shutting out a significant portion of the fleet, actually the portion of the fleet with a high compression engine that burn the majority of the fuel. So Curt, let's talk about what's happening at the airport level and what are some of the issues that you're hearing, and what can we collectively, the rest of you can chime in, do to help make sure that this doesn't become a nationwide problem of airports shutting down.
Thanks, Tom. A pleasure to be here with everyone. By show of hands, any flight schools from California or West Coast based? So a few of you. So you're under more stress than others, for sure. So the complexity, you're hearing the complexities from the engine manufacturers. They need to see this recipe of the fuel. You're hearing the EPA issues that we're dealing with. This train left the station and lead has to get out of the fuel. And your operations and airports and the fixed-based operators that supply the fuel today, you're caught in a catch-22 between the fuel recipe creation and the regulatory agencies that are going to approve this. And so many of you in the room, probably your operations and your aircraft will qualify possibly for the Swift fuel. The question is going to be, what's the price point and what's the impact? That's probably your practical question in your mind. But so to the question of what you can do today is, EPA is going to come out with this endangerment finding. They are going to note this will be a hazardous material. They will ban it. The FAA will go through their own rule-making process following that ultimately will create this termination right. And what that does to airports today is, the airports that we want to stay open and continue to serve and provide 100 low lead today, they do that under the grant obligations that they have that provide them the ability to stand up and say, this fuel is an available fuel and we're not going to force airports to close it. Unfortunately, at one airport in California, we're not seeing the FAA do that. But the truth is once that EPA determination is made and the FAA ultimately makes the determination that it's a banned substance, that takes away that right of the FAA to kind of stand behind that protection. And so what can we do now? So for the operators in California and airports and FBOs in California, we're encouraging them to, while we work through this process for 100% product, that implement the 94 octane where it financially makes sense. Try to partner with your FBOs and your airports. And there's a number of them in California that have done so where the airports actually are participating in it because of the price point complexity. Truth is that the UL product is more expensive, and until such time we have a more disbursement or a supply chain that will have more volume, you're going to see a price point disparity. And so, but if the airports can participate by reducing some of their fees or potentially giving credits to FBOs to make the capital investment requirements to bring this fuel in that needs to be segregated. These are things that you can do now while we wait for this transition, and we would encourage airports to do that. I saw this morning that Oxnard, California just came online, and they're going to be supplying the UL 94 product. I know Centennial Airport in Denver will come out next week, I believe, and take their first load. Provo, Utah, Utah Valley University's flight school is going to take the first load of fuel tomorrow, and I think they'll be probably one of the first programs, flight school programs, to actually implement and put the fuel at the airport. And none of these are eliminating the 100 low lead, but they're introducing the unleaded product now in advance.
Curt, I think one of the things that's going to be incumbent upon people in this room, though, is a lot of new people coming into aviation, is the education about what that means, because we've been using one fuel for a really long time. If you put this 94 fuel, which is good fuel for the right airplanes, but if it gets misfueled, it's going to be a problem. So that's one of the things I know you're challenged at the FBO level, but self-serve is part of the problem.
Yeah, so all of the major manufacturers, the suppliers that bring fuel to your airports today, a load of fuel comes with a standard. It meets that min spec, and the FBO can say, look, I understand this fuel is delivered in a recipe that I can commingle it in my tank. And that's one of the challenges that we're working through with the GAMI product today is we need to be able to see that to have the liability protections. And all the fuel suppliers today provide upwards of $50 million of product liability insurance to the FBOs that are selling that fuel. So this chain of custody process is really important. And to Mark's point, misfueling, and NATA has got a safety first program. We have a free program that we give out to train folks on the handling of fuel so we prevent misfueling. Because as one of the other nightmare situations is having that situation happen with two fuels out in the market.
And I will only add to the complexity of this issue is that both the GAMI fuel and the Swift 94 and eventually the 100, they can commingle with 100 low lead, but they cannot commingle with one another. They're not being tested with that. So you can see the challenge that we're faced with of, okay, out in California, if we're going to have GAMI fuel, we're going to have the 94 UL fuel and 100 low lead, how do we keep everyone safe, because you're not supposed to commingle those. And there's a whole series, this thing has more tentacles than you can possibly imagine.
So you can actually commingle it in the, so GAMI's fuel or Swift's fuel can commingle into the wing of the airplane with 100 low lead. They can't commingle in the tanks, the storage tanks. But what's not being tested, as Pete said, is they're not testing the GAMI product or the Swift product against the 100 low lead. That commingling situation hasn't been vetted out yet. And so the real question is, are we going to have 2 fuel products or 3 fuel products in the marketplace for 180 million gallons? It's unlikely that it would be efficient. It might ultimately just be one fuel.
I think even to kind of use a perfect example is, the 94 is out there, again, great fuel. But you can't take a 100 low lead and a 94 and put it in a high compression engine, because that will cause a problem, likely detonation. Where the GAMI fuel and the 100 low lead has been checked from a commingling and fungibility has been tested, and apparently at this point in time comfortable with that. But when you start to have 3 or potentially 4, we've got some real concerns.
So, Curt, it's great that there are some forward-looking airports out there that are protecting 100 low lead distribution. At the same time, they're trying to encourage the appropriate airplanes to be using the 94 Swift fuel. So, but unfortunately, that's the minority at the moment, and there's a lot of risk that some others. Ed and Jack, do you want to talk a little bit about what can we do from an FAA standpoint or Congress to weigh in and make sure that 100 low lead is protected until we really have a viable alternative out there widely available?
Yeah, and thanks, Tom, and again, thanks to all of you for being here and the major role you're playing in generating pilots, because America needs pilots. And we're all part of the same ecosystem. We need pilots. This is a all hands on deck challenge that we have. One of the reasons that America is able to generate commerce and trade throughout the United States is because we have over 5,000 public use aircraft or public use airports. And we've got over 200,000 aircraft that use those airports to create jobs and economic development. And so seeing our aircraft go away, seeing our airports go away starts to erode our nation's vital link in our nation's transportation infrastructure. So getting this right is really important. And we don't have an unlimited amount of time. We've taken it to 2030, which is a very short time to solve a problem that is more than 40 years in the making. And as has been stated, a lot of really smart people spending a lot of time and a lot of money have not found the clear solution that right now today we're ready to commercialize. So we're trying to work through and understand all of that. We do need the time. We're 2023, we need more than a year, we need more than 2 years, but the world needs to know we care, we're attacking this, we're looking for solutions. So a large part of what we're trying to do is make sure we're communicating. We're communicating the value of general aviation to the United States, the societal benefits inherent in that, the commitment that our industry is making to get this right, and working in a reasonable fashion. Now, the good news is, many, many years ago, the organizations at this, on this panel went to Congress and said, we need people who understand general aviation, who are willing to speak out for general aviation. And as a result of that, we've been able to have a general aviation caucus in the House and in the Senate. It's large and it's robust, and they're helping us articulate the societal benefits of this industry. But they need to know, just as the FAA needs to know, the public needs to know, we are making every effort possible to solve this. And I think as you're hearing now, we're identifying the problems, we're trying to remove the barriers, but the numbers in many cases work against us. We're a relatively small industry with a relatively large problem. We've got to do so in making sure that people are indemnified. We need to make sure that it is something that is affordable, it's available, and these are not small issues. So one of the things we can do is make sure that everybody in our community is understanding of what the issues are, the challenges that we face, the solutions we're committed to, and asking for help, making sure we have the time to finish the job. $50 million on the PAFI program to date, total commitment from all of the industry. This is something that we need to get across the finish line. There's just too much at stake not to do it. So being able to work with Congress to make sure there's availability, work with the FAA, and we've shown an ability to do that consistently, but we need to make sure we've got the right story, the right time, and the right place. We need to make sure we have our ask in order. And I think as we are going through this process, the more we're learning about what is solvable and what may need to take more time, we need to be able to understand that to make the ask.
So as Ed mentioned, as we're building the educational program around what's necessary for people to understand aviation, the big issue that we're facing now and addressing through FAA reauthorization, which is due later this year, is to legislate that the FAA needs to make sure that there is a continued path to ensure that we have leaded fuel through 2030 while we're in the process of transitioning out. FAA has stepped on it and not taken, I think, the full authority that they should have at some of these airports that they've removed, that they've allowed fuel to be removed. And that's really disheartening. And we have found over the years that what happens is that time you got to come in with legislation through Congress and dictate to the FAA how they're going to do their business. And we're very aggressively pursuing that to make sure that this doesn't get to be a snowball going downhill where every airport's pitching fuel off the airport when they've taken grant assurances and other things to make sure from the FAA to operate and run their airport that the FAA has the ability to step in and tell them that they can't do that or they're going to lose their funding at the airport. So that's really critical. I think you've heard this from us, early on. It's the safe transition to an unleaded fuel that's key. When they were talking about the mixing of fuel, Mark brought up the point that is the biggest one that we worry about today and why we're so adamant about promoting this as a safety problem is we've already had 2 aircraft that had in-flight engine failures. I think they were both in flight. at Reed Hillview because this high compression 100 LL engine was fueling at the self-serve pump and put in 94 octane, and it caused a problem. And so we have got to be really, be on edge about this being problems go forward, especially if we introduce more than one fuel, then it becomes even more complicated. We do have, while I have the mic, we do have on all the news that the problem's been solved and there's GAMI fuel out there on an STC, it cannot be used in experimental amateur-built airplanes right now. So those airplanes, amateur-built airplanes are not, STCs don't apply to them. So they do not have a path other than going out and getting fuel and testing it themselves or using the GAMI engines that have been tested, but you've got to go then do the compatibility test with the rest of your fuel system to make sure that it will work, which would be on the responsibility of the builder who did that. So that's a big problem.
Curt?
Tom, if I can, I think as you all leave here, I've heard these great stories that just the tremendous work that you're doing with your schools back in your home airports. The message that you can really help take back to help this legislative push is just educating your own local leaders, airports, and the congressional reps about the value of what your businesses are in flight training and the need for why fuel is important to you and why this transition that we're taking place, that we're trying to advocate for legislatively, that grassroots level comes up from the airports that you're all operating at.
So Jim, nobody learns to fly helicopters, learns to fly in a turbine helicopter, right, for the most part. They're flying piston engine helicopters in the training world. So what are you hearing from your constituency and what's going on there?
All right, well, we've got Enstrom in the crowd here, and I don't know, we got any other helicopter operators out there? It's pretty much a fixed wing crowd. All right, well, we use the same engine that the airplanes are using. So as you get into the larger engines, we have the same concerns that we're talking about. We're trying to test the actual engine in the aircraft for the STCs that are out there. So right now the STCs cover the airplanes, but not the helicopters. So so we do have some testing. We're still a little bit behind, and we're trying to get George's fuel out to all the manufacturers of the piston helicopters that are out there. So yeah, I do appreciate all the hard work that's going on here with keeping people interested in the industry, aviation. No matter what you do in aviation, I saw that all morning. You kicked out this great center here that we got to make sure we get more helicopter folks in. But other than that, thanks, and you got to remember the helicopters as well. So I'm looking forward to that fuel, so we don't have to worry about it. So it doesn't, people aren't. Like you said, you cannot, well you can, but you need some big bucks to go right into a turbine. So yeah, they are, the smaller aircraft piston engines are the way to start into the helicopter community.
Yeah. So Curt, you talked about some of the airport issues. You mentioned Centennial. They're doing some unusual things there. Can you talk about some of the specific tactics that they're using at Centennial to maybe help offset some of the costs and encourage people?
Seen that same pattern with some other airports too, that how airports can put skin in the game to help the operators. Every airport charges a flowage fee for every gallon that's pumped on the airport. The airport gets a percentage or fees, cents per gallon on that sale. And one of the things we're seeing airports do is waiving those flowage fees to implement and help the price point, if you will. Unfortunately, it's just not enough. I mean, you're talking about flowage fees of anywhere from 6 to 11, 12 cents a gallon. And we need to close the delta on that. But some of the other things, Santa Monica of all airports, the most dysfunctional airport in the country, Santa Monica was the first airport in Southern California to bring unleaded fuel in, and they did so, and they actually paid for the STCs. They paid for the logbook entries of the STCs, and they reduced the cost. And so they're giving credit to tenants to do this, and they're subsidizing the program. And so it has to be done that way just because of the cost margin. Because if there's still 100 low-lead in the marketplace and there's unleaded available at a spread that's there, operators are going to make the easy decision. We got to work on those issues to make it more commercially viable and bring more fuel to the marketplace so that we can get the volume up to get the price down. Right.
So if we had a fuel available today, was all approved and through the PAFI process or whatever, there's still a lot of steps to be done to get it to the airports. And that's going to take some cooperation from the current refiners and oil companies that we traditionally know. There may be some others that will be able to play in this new market because of the different formulas and that sort of thing that come about. So maybe some other types of companies, but there's going to be a lot of traditional ones there. Mark, I know you talk to a lot of the oil companies and the refiners and that sort of thing. What are you hearing? What are their biggest concerns, and how do we help them get past those?
Well, first off, this is an incredibly knowledgeable group. I probably don't need to spend too much time on this, but the difference between the STC and maybe the PAFI program, which would be a fleet-wide, you do have to have that piece of paper, and it has to be in your logbook, and it has to be signed by an A&P right now. So if you think you're going to stop in a place, even by 94, let alone GAMI, you are required to have an STC to actually legally burn that gas. I want to remind this group that just before you stop in and try and buy it. But again, this group's knowledgeable, but you have the responsibility to pass on that knowledge to your students and your rest of your young instructors. You know, the refiners, I spent a couple hours this morning with Phillips, which is is the largest distributor and a refiner of avgas, and has a long history in avgas, and has been, really a very important part of our supply chain of fuel. There's 9 or 10 refiners out in the country that really make avgas in any kind of quantity, and that gets shipped all the way to the South Pacific, South America, Alaska, everywhere. And so we have a very small number of refiners that are actually in this business of this fuel. And for most of them, Chevron and Exxon, it's such a small percentage. My biggest concern, and the reason we keep them in the loop, is that they could just get up on a Tuesday morning and say, we're just not going to do this anymore. And that would be a real problem. So one of the things in the Eagle program, we've asked them to say, give us long lead times if you're thinking about anything here around this issue, because we believe in a safe transition. We believe there's going to be need to manufacture this fuel and refine it or blend it in some kind of levels with whomever wins the marketplace. And so the business is going to be good. And we keep talking about how robust aviation is right now, that the fuel might be for the first time in a long time actually increasing in usage from 20 million flight hours pre-COVID to 26 million flight hours last year. So there's actually more volume going out there. It's still pretty small for most of them. So that's my biggest concern, is keeping them in the loop where they're at, and where Phillips wanted to have a conversation about where they think they're going to be at with potential fuel that they may have. But they're very concerned about the liability that evolves either out of this endangerment finding in terms of where they want to go with fuel, or possible new fuels and who's going to actually blend them or make them. So it's a lot going on right now and a lot of unknowns, more uncertainty than anything. And then, of course, we need insurance to get this all covered with very little knowledge at this point in time.
Yeah. So Eagle put a stake in the ground of 2030. This would get done. How likely is it that it will actually, this is open to anybody here, that it's actually get done, or ideally even sooner than that? Can y'all put any thing behind that? Is it likely to occur quickly, or is this really going to take to 2030?
We're optimistic. I think that fuels will make it through this process, but then again, can it be commercially viable in the time that we need it? So to tack on to what Mark was saying, so Swift's plan is, currently you're out there with 94 UL, you have the STC. Their plan is once they get their 100 UL approved, no one has to get another STC. It'll just be a transparent switch to their 100 octane fuel in their current distribution system, and then they would start expanding that. GAMI's strategy is different than that, so we're trying to watch, and as Joe Brown always harps on me, the marketplace is going to dictate if one of those companies emerges as the winner, or if there is a way to have more than one fuel, we at some point are going to have to go to them and say, okay, now you got to test to make sure that they can commingle with one another. But I am optimistic that we will get there. Now, is it going to be a complete drop-in? And that's always been our holy grail, and that's one of the reasons why, as Mark pointed out, we've been at this a long time, because we wanted the 100% solution. There's some engines out there that in the end, and it's very, very few, we may not be able to cover, but we know we can get there. We can get to a 97, possibly a 98 octane, and we could do that today. But we really want to have higher octane, more solution to cover more. But in the end, if there is a small number of engines that are out there, we as an industry are going to have to deal with it, but we will have a solution. I am very optimistic in that regard.
I think what Pete's saying is, if you stood here a year ago and the Eagle was just getting formed at that point in time, there was no fuel approved. We had none. You know, GAMI's been working on it for a long time. Swift had their 94, but they've been working on their 100 for a long time. You know, there's been hundreds of formulas tested at the tech center under the PAFI program. But I do believe the energy that came into Eagle helped the FAA get the first one across the line with the STC. There's no question that we created an urgency to do something. So I think that we can take a little credit from an Eagle perspective that we're trying to create energy in this thing. 2030 is going to show up a lot faster than we like, no question about it. And, you know, the whole reason we've got this group together is because there's so many pieces that's got to come together all at the right time, the right place. I am optimistic, though. I really do think we can get it done.
All right. Well, before we go to Q&A, any points that you want to make that we haven't already made, Jack?
The only comment I want to make, and I think I'm in Joe Brown's camp on most of the stuff, is it's great these guys are optimistic. I am convinced that it can't happen unless we have a single spec, and the petroleum companies are going to dictate how this all ends. And I think it's something you can't ignore and can't overlook, because they don't want to distribute multiple fuels, and nobody wants to have multiple fuels at the airport. So that's how this race is being run. If GAMI would get the single spec now, they'd have a significant distinct advantage over the other ones. Swift is saying that they might get the spec along with their STC, which will be advantageous to them. But I think at the end of the day, you can't overlook the guiding principles of what drives the marketplace, which is it's got to have a spec. That way you got liability coverage. Nobody's going to distribute multiple, because the distribution channel for fuel is very fragile. It's not an open, take it anywhere you want, any method that you want. So to get the volumes that you need at all the locations across the United States and the rest of the world, you have to have multiple producers and multiple locations to handle that. That's like a 3-year buildup just to get them all online. So we got to hurry, and we got to get to one fuel.
And I would just add, you know, we all saw what happened in Washington State recently, and Mark put his team to work very quickly to try to beat back something that would have been very debilitating. The worst strategy for this industry that I could see right now, and I am concerned, and I'll be quite frank, I'm concerned if GAMI goes out and tells everybody, we have the solution before we have all of the commercial viability solved. This is the result. The result will be communities will just say, okay, there is a solution out there, we're just plain old going to ban it. And that's what we saw start to happen in Washington State. And you all need to be out there helping us spread the messages. We are not there yet. And if that strategy goes forward, we could seriously harm this entire industry. So please, and when you talk to the aviation press, ask them to ask some of the tough questions out there, because right now there's only been one narrative, and that is the solution is done. Well, the manufacturers haven't been able to validate all of it because we don't have that spec that Jack talked about. The distribution chain doesn't have the spec to make sure that all the rail cars have the right lining in them, that all of the tanks that you go through in the whole logistics process are compatible with those. Those are some of the concerns that are still out there that have to be solved, and transparency will help this issue.
So let's just say that one of the STC fuels, Swift, GAMI, maybe somebody else comes along in the STC process, gets the spec. Is there, let's all admit that the STC process for me as Mr. Aircraft owner is awkward. Is there a pathway then to somehow eliminate the requirement for an STC and allow it to the FAA somehow to approve these fuels without the STC?
So it's in the legislation that was actually 2 reauthorizations ago that allows, through the PAFI program, to give a fleet authorization. Right. But it does have the words ASTM in it. Now we've been all working with the FAA that there's some latitude in it that we could arrive at a standard for the industry that may not be an ASTM spec. But ultimately, who would approve that standard? It's going to be the same people. It's going to be the manufacturers, the distributors, all of us are going to have people in that process that ultimately approve it. So again, that's why transparency is important. But what we're going to see the FAA do, and Mark could verify this, but at our last Eagle meeting, the FAA is going to come out with a fleet authorization for, I think they're going to start with a 90. And yeah, 90. And it's really, it's not available out there. So we're not talking the 94 UL, but what they want to do is they want to demonstrate a capability to do a fleet authorization so that when we do find the 100 solution that they can go and replicate that, because they've got big hurdles of their own legal department and the General Counsel's Office at the FAA and also at DOT. So they want to go and see if they can do this. And with a fleet authorization gives us that indemnification to some extent that the federal government has approved and blessed this fuel that's out there.
I think that is an important step to prove that they can go get a process to get it done because it's never been tested before. The FAA has done, Joe Brown knows better than anybody, but millions of STCs. I mean, and that is a first level of supplemental type certificate that says we're satisfied that this product works.
Right.
Now, because it's a fuel, it has a much broader implication in terms of distributors, blenders, how do you make it and copy it exactly? Not just in this country, the rest of the world is looking at us to see how you're going to supply this fuel in a consistent methodology. But I am happy that the STC was granted by strong review like they do in every other STC that they've done. And so they're satisfied at the FAA level at this point. They haven't solved the rest of our problem, however, how to get it into the market.
Okay, well, good stuff, guys. Thanks for sharing your expertise and for being here. We've got the DC brain trust here, as I said. So
very limited brains.
And what questions do you have, both either about fuels or anything else going on relative to jet aviation? Joe.
I just wanted to start by saying it's really a testament to the substance of the redbird migration that these folks cleared their calendar to be here. And it's a testament to the best slate of industry leaders we've ever had that you would clear your calendar to be here. And you're fighting for our way of life, and I just want to thank you. A non-fuel question. It really is extraordinary, you guys. A non-fuel question, FAA administration. Anybody want to weigh in on that, or are you going to run? Where do you see this?
Jack. Where can you be there, Joe?
Where do you see this going? And sidecar question to that is, will anybody take the job if FAA doesn't go back to the office?
Let me just weigh in 2 seconds. I think the leadership matters in any business, any activity. And unfortunately, I don't think Billy Nolan's a bad guy. I think when you're acting, however, you're limited, very limited in your scope and your confidence to move the rest of management in a strategic direction. And the FAA needs more strategic leadership today than probably my 10 years that I've been doing. And, I think it's just unfair to the management at the FAA and to workers in the FAA that are trying to get work done, but they don't know where the North Star is. So I'm very frustrated that we haven't been able to find leadership and put it in place. We've all been able to work with all kinds of different leaders. And the inability to have a leader to work with is really unforgivable. And there are people that would do that job. I think there are lots of people that can do that job that have some aviation background. So I just keep pushing harder as we can. I know that Michael Huerta has been asked by the White House to come up with some thoughts about who that might be. Michael was very good for general aviation, and at least he's getting an opinion weighed in at this point in time.
The other challenge is that many of the folks that we work with on the regulatory side on a day-to-day basis are actually wanting to help. But they need that leadership level that, that North Star Mark says is they don't have necessarily the confidence to go out and make decisions. And so the folks that are helping with the Eagle, we've changed that direction and put more energy there. And they're out on the edge pushing that, but they definitely need to have leadership in the executive branch. And it starts at the executive branch through DOT to have a vision to support this and put a leader in that's going to really listen to all the issues and then give confidence to the staff.
I would just say that, it's not just an FAA problem. It goes up to the Department of Transportation, and it goes to the federal government. So as Joe pointed out, a lot of, especially the folks in the flight standard side of the house, but also on the cert side of the house, they're still working from home. So now you have this mass exodus of experience out there, and normally you get OJT training when you go to the office, you can ask questions, go to the other cubicle. That doesn't exist now. A lot of you probably called people at the FSDO and you can't get an answer. Okay, in this day and age, 2023, they can't remote their phones to their home where they're supposed to be more efficient. But this isn't an FAA problem, it's a federal government problem. And all of us, we go over to the FAA pretty often. You can throw a bowling ball down that alley day in, day out, and they're not people working in the headquarters. But I see that over at NASA, at the NASA headquarters as well. I mean, that is a problem. Now, the part of the FAA that works, the ATC program that we can never let be privatized, by the way, because that's the part that works. They're in the office and they're working hard. There's less controllers now than there were 10 years ago, which is phenomenal to me that we have less controllers and yet there's more activity out there. But the part of the FAA that has been broken is all of that flight standard cert. Look at the registry. How far behind was the registry? I think, Jack, you had an airplane that took almost a year and they keep saying, well, here's your temporary email that should be good enough. Well, what do? We focused on it at the end of last year, and I just talked to the head of the union that handles the registry. He goes, good news, we're caught up to 2023. You know, so now we're only 4 months behind where we were a year behind, but it's because they're focusing on it. And that's what a leader will do. If we have the right leader at the FAA that has the right stoplight charts and says, okay, if you got a problem in this VSDO, what are you doing? You know, the head of all, Larry Fields is the head right now of the flight standard side. What are you doing to make sure that that FSDO gets help over there? That's the kind of leadership that we need at the FAA right now.
Other question? Over here.
Hi, I'm Brian Guttry, and when I'm not flight instructing in Dubuque, I'm an attorney and teach some of my students about some of the debacles at the FAA, because they kind of thumb their nose at Congress sometimes. Pilot records database is one of those items. What can happen in the reauthorization bill to give Congress some more teeth with the FAA, number one? And then two, going back to the fuel issue, what's Europe doing in this conversation? I know, we're the leaders here, but I know Europe's been having some conversations too.
I can talk a little about the European fuels initiative that, they've got Sweden who has a different fuel for the smaller engines, and they have the higher compression fuel available too at very high prices because they don't have one fuel that has economic viability. That's one of the concerns we're trying to protect here, is to make sure that we have one fuel that satisfies all, because it's just too small to start subdividing into really specialty chemicals at that point in time. So that's what I think. And I think the reauthorization is something that we are all working on as an opportunity with Sam Graves, who's a GA pilot, Warbird pilot, and most of us know him very well, to really move forward and advance the ball on certain things in aviation that make sense for us. Is there an opportunity to expand basic med as an example, one of the things that we look at, because with the great success we've had with basic med today, could we actually up the game in that? There's so many other opportunities in aviation to put, the initiative to have the NCAA, which is the National Center for the Advancement of Aviation, pooling all the groups that work so hard, including EA and AOPA, to try and bring young people into aviation. And how do we help the whole industry be smart to use the best of the best ideas and share ideas? So I'm actually pretty excited about the reauthorization, and there's a lot of detail underneath that. And I know Ed and others have lots of thoughts on it. Pete?
Yeah, I think the FAA reauthorization presents a unique opportunity for us to try to make major changes. But I will say, to underscore the importance, you have to have a leader work that through, because otherwise you have a situation where, a member of the FAA comes up to testify and says, well, that's not in my purview. And obviously you see things falling apart. You need a leader that says, this is where it all comes together, and this is what we care about. And as Pete said, we know it works. We went from 186 days on the registry. They're now closer to 70. They promised they'll get to 30. But I think one of the things that we can ask in a reauthorization is, why 30? Why 3? Why are we still relying on paperwork rather than technology? Are there a couple places where we can force through the digitization of the process itself? And the registration is a perfect place to do that. We see it with medical reforms as well. There are a couple of key areas where there has to be accountability. You need a leader to be able to go before Congress. You need Congress to be able to exercise its oversight, but they've got to be overseeing people. and someone's got to be there to put in place the accountability and the processes that are so important. We want to make sure that we get a bill done, and it's a bill that moves us forward, that we don't spend the next several years trying to say, well, okay, what does that mean? How would we really interpret that? Where are we going to go from here? We need to say, here's where we are, and there's where we need to go. Now let's be about it. And I think that's what this particular reauthorization gives us an opportunity to do, because as Mark said, we've got some people at the heads of the committee that understand general aviation. They understand aviation. We've seen people care who the administrator is, because they've been pretty clear on what they don't want to see in an administrator. Let's figure out what we can get done, and let's be about doing it.
Yeah, I think your question was, once Congress tells the FAA to do something, how do you get the FAA to actually report back to Congress? And from my time in the FAA, I understand that's what happens. And what you see up here is when we all unite together, and not only do we work with Congress to tell Congress what to tell the FAA, but then we meet regularly with the FAA to say, that was really important. That's the reason we met with Congress. We'd really like you to do this stuff. And I think that's how we make it happen.
The FAA hates congressional direction. They just, and they, you know, the plea to a lot of us was, don't give us more to do. But at the same time, we all realize that that sometimes is the only thing that they will listen to. But that doesn't mean that storm clouds are not on the horizon. Several of us were called in one by one into Senator Cruz's office. Senator Cruz is the ranking member on Senate Commerce, so he's pretty important to us. Well, during the big privatization fight, he was the one Republican senator that really supported privatization. And so he mentioned to all of us that were either face-to-face or on a call with him and said, I understand I can't privatize the system without GA. You guys have proved that we can't do it. So how are you going to come on board with privatization? And we're all just sitting there going, are you smoking something? There's no way we're going to ever support privatization. And yet he's still on this kick. So we can't let our guard down. But I will say that I've never seen civil aviation as a whole so united as it is right now. I think there will be a note released, a letter that we all signed on to today or tomorrow about federal preemption and how important federal preemption is. But I think what we're all doing to build the pilot workforce that directly relates to what you're doing is now it's a team sport for the entire industry. What Mark and Jack and everybody are doing, we're getting great support out of the airlines right now because that we rely on one another. So I'm very encouraged that we can speak much more clearly with one voice as civil aviation than we ever could before.
Next question. Somebody behind the pole?
Question, can you say a little bit more about the two Reed Hillview accidents or incidents with the gasoline?
So as we understand it, this is, and Justin can fill in the exact stuff because we have the reports from the FAA and TSB, I guess, in both of them. One of them was an aircraft that had sat around for quite a while, didn't have enough fuel to leave the airport, left with probably a little too light on fuel because there wasn't any 100 low lead for that aircraft to be fueled with and cause that plane to, they run a lot better with gas than without.
Yeah.
If you have to teach your students that or your instructors, pay attention to that.
It's not an accident when they run out of gas.
It's not an accident when you run out of gas. So that was probably the leading cause of that. The other one appears to be possibly, we're still working through that, I mean, it's fueling in combination. So those are the ones that we know about and what we've been reading so far that's published.
But in specific with Reed Hillview, I think that it's fascinating that we were all watching, we were all on these emails that the FAA was responding to, and we all know the real reason that all of this is happening at Reed Hillview is they want to close. And now they tried to use noise for years and years, and now they're using the fuel situation. But basically, the regional director for the airports came back and said, okay, we're closing down this investigation and everything because now there is a fleet approval for a fuel out there. And we all looked at this and we go, what is this bureaucrat talking about? And Jack was the first one to come back and go, basically you're full of beans here, and to the whole group. And then, you know, we shot a letter over to the head of airports at the FAA going, why don't you guys internally talk to your FAA people that are working with us on Eagle so that you make sure that you can at least get letters right and correspondence right? And of course, all the placating of the Hillview community is because DOT, at direction of the White House, said, go ahead and reward this airport that's banning fuel because that's what we want to have happen. That's how dysfunctional right now the federal government is in talking to one another and having a coherent policy. It's very frustrating.
Which reinforces the need to go back to your airports, talk to your local elected leaders, make sure they understand it. There is a lot of placating that's going on in these sensitive, environmental sensitive areas where the elected leaders are telling, well, yeah, there's fuels available, so now we're going to go down and ban the current one. They don't understand, and unless they hear from the industry, that voice is going to have a louder voice.
Okay, I think we are actually beyond time, but let's take one more question.
Yeah, hi, Paul Breidecker with NAFI. I don't have a question, but it's just a follow-on comment to what Joe Brown said about, the leadership position. I think everybody understands well that this industry is subject to a lot of churn right now. There's opportunities for pilots, for maintenance people, for avionics people. There's a lot of movement, but there's probably no greater example of churn right now than what's happening in the FAA. If we all remember, Steve Dixon was the administrator, and when he resigned, the recently hired Billy Nolan was director of aviation safety. So he was tapped to then become the acting administrator. About the same time, David Bolter had been tapped to lead flight standards. So the executive director of flight standards was then moved to manage the Office of Aviation Safety, which means flight standards office was left with no director. So it's not just our administrator, but the trickle-down effect is huge because all of the people that we deal with kind of in the trenches, and flight standards is certainly one of them, is being managed by deputies who are in acting positions. And as the one gentleman said, your authority in that situation is somewhat limited. So clearly there's not a one-size-fits-all answer to this, but what Joe said is absolutely true, and it's filtered down into the rest of the people that we work with. So the sooner the better.
Okay, thank you for that. And thank you all for being here and taking the time on your schedules to come in and address the group.